Okay, so with that introduction, I have been stalked many times on Twitter. I just did my first live Twitter chat yesterday, which was an experience. So I'm Eric McNulty. I'm the Associate Director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. We are a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government, which makes us the program with the longest title on the planet. And nobody ever gets it quite right, and I think it only makes lawyers and deans happy. No offense, Craig. But whoever cooked up that affiliation wasn't worried about people actually ever say it. But what we do, and we've been doing for the last 15 plus years, is looking at the challenges of leading through crisis. And can I share a screen here, Kitty? Can I do that?
Sure.
Let me see if I do screen.
So you go to the bottom, and it says share in the middle. Yeah, there you go.
There you go. I'm going to put that up. I'm going to put that up like that.
Yep.
There we go. So that will show you some of what we've done over the last 15 years. I won't go into all of them, but it was shortly after 9/11 when some folks at the federal government came up and asked Harvard to establish a platform for looking at the topic of leadership. And at first trying to get federal agencies to play better with each other, and then federal, state, and local, and then public, private, nonprofit. So it really has evolved over that time. And what we have tried to do is to embed ourselves with the people who are leading during an event where possible, and as soon thereafter when not. And obviously we can't get to everything, but as you can see here, we've gotten to quite a few things. And that's largely thanks to our generous alums. Who are in senior roles, people like yourselves, who when something interesting happens will call up and say, hey, why don't you come down and hang out for a couple of days? I've been with the program since 2008. I spent 10 years prior to that at Harvard Business School in their publishing group. So I came over in 2008 and was actually new to this world. I knew quite a bit about leadership in business settings and in private sector organizations. This was all new to me and fascinating, and met some really interesting people and found ways to knit what I knew to my colleagues, Lenny Marcus and Barry Dorn, what they have been doing, weave that together and begin to go, build out an understanding of what it takes to lead in these really difficult situations. And so my first deployment was in 2010 down at Deepwater Horizon. With Peter Neffinger, who was the Deputy National Incident Commander. Spent time with him. Mary Landry, who was the Unified Area Commander with the Coast Guard, was the current student at the time. She got the award for Best Class Project. Bill of National Significance was a pretty good one. And then ever since I've been out during Sandy, was down with Rich Serino and FEMA, the FEMA Innovation Team, as well as with the Coast Guard down in New York and New Jersey. Marathon response obviously happens right here in our backyard. Secret Service, we've done a number of things looking at NSSEs, and then it's sort of on and on. I'm not going to go through them all. But what we have done over that time is built up a pretty significant body of knowledge, a lot of which can't be published, which is always a challenge for us. So we can share it in a classroom, but because if I'm deploying to an incident, there's no time to go to the IRB and say, here's my research protocol, please approve it. Because by the time they approve it, the incident will be over and we'll be writing the history books. So you can't do that. And also, like I said, we're shadowing people. We are never there to see, is Sally a great leader or a terrible leader? It's sort of, what does Sally do that works or doesn't work that might be helpful to other people in the future? And so there are times I'm in rooms where I can't take notes. There are times we're on conference calls where not everyone realizes we're there. So we try and do a really good job of not telling tales out of school. However, and then try to share them in the classroom in a way that are capture some of the excitement of being there, but doesn't give away anything that would embarrass someone or make them think like we were not doing our job discreetly enough. And so what we have done over those 15 years, we've developed a model we call meta leadership. And I'll just show it to you here. It's 3 dimensions. It's fairly simple in its structure. It's the person. Who are you as an individual? I mean, every one of you on this call looks different. You've got different backgrounds, different experience, different education, different birth order, all kinds of stuff that make you distinct. So how do you live into a leadership role given who you are, and not just ticking the 13 boxes of here's the things someone said leaders have to do, but how do you inhabit that as a distinct individual? And then, of course, you as an individual are in a situation. There's a context around this leadership challenge you're facing. Is it a crisis? Is it routine? Are we trying to reinvent an agency? Are we having to shrink because the Congress cut off our funding or cut back our funding? What's the situation? And the better you understand what's happening, the more likely you are to figure out what actually needs to be done. And the third dimension is connectivity. And that's the relationships with which through which you lead. And the first of these is leading down. That's where most of the leadership study is. You as the boss, who are your subordinates, who's your team. And there's lots and lots of work there. But that's only the start. You've also got to lead up to your boss and help that person make good decisions, understand what's happening on the front lines, prioritize what needs to be done. And that's one where the people find really challenging, particularly in this field when you've got professionals, subject matter experts who really know what they're doing, have to lead up to elected officials and others who may not have that expertise, but who expect to be in charge or who expect to be the face of an incident. And so that's a whole skill of understanding what's going on in their world and how do you navigate that in a way that you can add some value and not wind up out of a job at the end of it. And then, of course, there's across and beyond. So across are the different silos within an organization, different departments, functions, whatever. And then beyond are all its external constituencies you may need, who may be essential to your success. But in a true crisis, no one's acting alone. So FEMA never does anything by themselves. The CDC doesn't do anything by themselves, rarely doesn't by themselves. Who else do you need to enlist? And that includes the general public, the media, private sector, all those other entities. And so that's the framework. And I say we just published a book this summer called You're It, which captures the first 15 years of what we've done. But what I wanted to talk to you guys about today, in more depth and really have a discussion, is some of the research we did, because I think I really value your experience and your time in the field. And so we went out to our alumni base and asked a question. We do a lot of work around with the behavioral work and applied neuroscience and looking at emotional intelligence and those other factors that build into particularly that dimension of the person. And we see some people get it right. I've seen a lot of people get it wrong, and try to figure out how much of that is accidental, how much of that could be changed and improved upon. So we went out to our alumni database, sent them out a survey, and this one did get approved by the IRB. And first we screened and said, have you been trained and certified in ICS, NIMS, or some other formal incident management system? And we called those folks out. That's what we wanted to look at. And then we said, have you observed leader behaviors that either improved team performance or degraded it? And we gave them a roster of a list of potential behaviors they might have seen. And no giant surprise here, is that good behavior is good. Then we looked at these again. So when we teach, we go through a process of analyzing good leader, lousy leader from people's experience, and what are the things that people have seen in people they were enthusiastic to follow, who really thought were really terrific. What about them made them that kind of leader? And these are some of those. So that's how we put together our scale to ask people these questions. And you can see here that, again, people who do classic good behavior do improve team performance. So having confidence, the ability to moderate stress, be able to communicate clearly. People observe that. You can see it's up over 80%. Every one of these was over 60%. And so there's a pretty strong indicator. And again, there's no surprise here. This is not going to win the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics or anything. But these have been observed, and within people who are in a structured environment that they all know what's supposed to happen, and within that structure of ICS or NIMS, that this actually improved performance. Okay, and then we asked them the opposite. Have you seen things that did not, that degraded team performance? And again, no big surprise here, bad behavior is bad. And again, everything had been seen here more than 50, at least 50%, more than 50% of the time, with poor communications, ego-driven behavior, and obsession with details being the big winners, and everything else tailing behind. But again, a pretty interesting array, and it was not much surprise there in terms of what, some surprise in the exact order of things. But if you can't communicate well, if you're obsessed about yourself when you should be worrying about everybody else, those things are not going to be good. So that painted a pretty clear picture of what works and what doesn't. So we then asked them, okay, in your training for ICS and NIMS, how many of you had any kind of behavioral training related to any of this? And here was the surprise, which is how low it is, or it was at least among this group. So you look here, that almost half of them had some training in decision-making or decision-making capacity. That's good. But things like emotional intelligence that are not new, and there's lots of research that show that it's essential to succeeding as a leader, under 20%, about 16%, had some training around that. The brain under stress, and we do a lot of this in our program, talking about how you actually function, where, what happens to the brain when you're in distress and how do you overcome it? Again, about 15% had some of that as part of their ICS training. Cognitive bias, again, it really shapes how we see the world and how we perceive what needs to be done, and who's a friend, who's an ally, who's an enemy. Really important to understand that. Only about 15%. Psychological safety, which was over 23% of people had seen that, which is, I actually was always encouraging, because psychological safety is a fairly new area of research, and this is where creating an environment where it's okay to take interpersonal risk. It's what a psychologically safe environment. This is one where Google has found, when they looked at all their teams, what was the differentiator between high-performing teams and low-performing teams. A psychologically safe environment was the #1 indicator of a high-performing team. Mm-hmm. The original research out of Harvard Business School, my colleague Amy Edmondson did with medical teams. The more open a medical team was to discussing mistakes and near mistakes, the fewer mistakes they made. I mean, again, there's a fair body of knowledge here of how important this is, and we had less than 25% who had seen it. And mindfulness, we threw in there to see, because again, it's becoming more common in organizations. I'm not sure about public sector, but I just spoke at a conference with private sector folks who are adapting variations on mindfulness programs or meditation programs or things to try and moderate stress and help people cope better with a tough job. So that was sort of the top line of the research. What I really wanted to find out from, first of all, what's your reaction to that? Are you surprised? Are you not surprised? Any thoughts on why it seems very few people have thought to kind of bring this kind of training alongside the what to do, but kind of the how do you manage and how do you behave in ways that get that team to perform better?
Well, I'm not surprised about the training and decision-making capacity. That makes sense. I am surprised at the low rate of training or knowledge about emotional intelligence and the cognitive biases.
Yeah, those are not new or again, it's not a
no.
It isn't cutting edge science, and
so Eric, I guess excuse me, my question is, what kind of correlation did you do? Any correlation with any of these good behaviors, bad behaviors with actually leadership performance or leadership effectiveness or anything like that, so that you can, said that, okay, yeah, strengths are more important. I'm a true believer in strength-based anything, yeah, and everything, and so I'm not too worried about the bad behavior, because we can't just say, okay, just don't be bad, because tell a bad leader what not to do, and they'll just be,
Yeah.
bad.
They won't necessarily pay attention to you.
So the core, and this was obviously sort of a first step in studying this. All we could look at in this one was, had you observed these behaviors or not? And what we would love to do, and if I ever can find the funding to do it, is to go find someone who's doing ICS training or NIMS training and say, let's try some modules of behavioral stuff alongside. Let's have a control group and let's see. And then going through an exercise or a simulation, does understanding how to do this, not only what is emotional intelligence, but how do you exhibit it? What are some ways you can build it? Cognitive bias, how can you structure that into your how your team is operating and people that are aware of it and compensating for it? Those kinds of things. Does it actually improve performance? We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I were the grant giver on those for that kind of a proposal, I wouldn't grant the funds, because I would rather say, you could have asked just a few more questions on this survey of good and bad behavior by asking, so on the leaders who you judge as highly effective, what behaviors did you see as their strengths?
Okay.
You see what I mean? And
Yeah.
then you are correlating it to effectiveness by asking people's reactions, and people's reactions are valid, verifiable, and reliable. So
Yes, although I will say that those original two, the list of good and bad behaviors, those were derived, and unfortunately we weren't doing it in as controlled a way as we might have, but through several hundred training sessions where we say, tell me about your great leader, tell me about your lousy leader, what just differentiates them. That's where those two lists came from.
okay.
And they were and I said, I'll be doing it again in Seattle on Monday. I'll do a similar exercise, and I can predict, with the exception of one or two variables, what comes up every single time.
Oh, no doubt about that. I don't doubt that at all. I just
No, it's good to hear that.
I'm trying to there's been so much research on the strength-based approach anyway now that I think it's like a finding, not like gravity, not an approach anymore. And so
Right.
yeah. So that's why, and as far as training goes, I think you should develop your strengths. So like out of the blue, I say, well, so I see now that cognitive bias is the lowest scoring training indicator on this list. So let's do a course in cognitive bias. You see what I mean? That's the kind of the normal approach on this. Whereas I don't know what is needed, because I would really want to leverage folks' strengths. And so I would, look at the strengths that were in the group, and I would actually try to make the good ones even stronger, even better. And whatever that happened to be as a subject or topic, rather than kind of a generic list that we see here.
Okay, Eric, I'd like to respond to your question from my perspective, as I made a point of not taking on a supervisory position in government. I supervised in the private sector for 8 years, and frankly, it wasn't my cup of tea because of what it did to my creativity. So I will tell you what I observed at the U.S. Department of Education in both a regional office, San Francisco, and in headquarters, and in federal student aid, and 3 other components. And these things like emotional intelligence, psychological safety, they were really viewed as not important, or maybe important but not as important as this thing you need to learn so that you don't create a cybersecurity incident, or you can't do your job adequately. And my thought on that, over the 19 years I was a part of the Department of Education, was that was because we had the luxury of not paying attention to it, because things were so stable and sort of sleepy, except for federal student aid, which has to sort of keep up, because at the time it had 14 million students that were sort of pinging it, and then various college administrators. But the thing is, still, it's slower, it's more stable than, say, a warfighting group or a group like FEMA that responds to emergencies. And those things are just, no one has really made the connection for people between what these qualities, if people were more mindful, if people were on top of their cognitive biases, sort of understood them and were trying to push back on them or develop more open minds, if people were more emotionally intelligent, what that would do for their work and the pursuit of the mission inside an agency that's doing those particular things. It's more stable. There's not much emergency or sense of urgency. And it's like, I'm gonna go through this until I retire, and then I'm gonna go off and, take a cruise or whatever. There's no sense of urgency. And I think that's why I mean, these numbers don't surprise me, and they aren't going to change until somebody shows people how it matters. And I think that the learning and development community isn't able to do that right now.
Yeah, I mean, it worries me a bit that, I mean, there are some of these that people should at least know what they are.
Yep.
And whether they're placed to your strengths or your weaknesses, you ought to know what they are. And to the extent, and then sort of following what Jim was thinking about, I spoke with one CEO who had been through a major crisis that almost brought the company under. And after that, he put somebody on the crisis response team that was the cognitive bias expert, and said, your job is to watch for it, point it out to us when it happens, and be, it was like a devil's advocate role. But look, when we're getting into groupthink, look when we're not taking in certain stakeholder perspectives. And so that was a way of giving an individual a role to escalate the capacity of the team by saying, you're worrying about this. I think that having done a lot of training on that, so how to work with your brain under stress, although it's not necessarily new, it's new to a lot of people. And that is helpful. It's helpful, it's helpful when you come home and you found out your significant other got to do a fender bender on the, on her commute home. That to react in a way that's a little more measured and don't go through the roof. But it is interesting, and I have come up against that same thing, Kitty, that you saw of, oh, this stuff isn't that important. We're worrying about sort of the structure of the management, the what to do, and we're sort of assuming everybody's going to behave well in those roles, and not taking it to the next level.
One thing I would like to tell you, and I'll email you her contact information in case you don't already know her. There's a woman, Carmen Medina, who was maybe the top analyst at CIA and before she retired, but she is an expert on cognitive bias, and I think her opinion would be worth having, and I will send that to you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
One thing I see going on, at least here, is that we seem to be bringing in leadership that has an assumption and a bias again, where they assume they're entering an organization that thinks like they do.
Mhm.
And it's not an organization that thinks like they do. So all their communication strategies, the messages are being misfired, and the reception of the people who don't think and follow as they do is there's a disconnect in reception and what's being sent, and is creating not real good structural leadership for this organization, even though I can see the leadership capability, but it's hard to communicate that. And there doesn't seem to be any particular attempt to tie a communication strategy to having the senior leader speaking the same language as the people that they need to lead. Have you had anything in your studies that tell anything about that story?
I don't have data behind it, but I will say one of the things I have seen that is a real trap for people who are coming into, and I've seen it sort of again in the crisis response world. If you're coming in, it's your turn to you're stepping into a senior role in the emergency operations center, whatever the person behind you is leaving. If you try and impose your style and your thoughts and everything, thinking everyone's just going to flip around and fall in line behind you without taking into account what they're already doing and what they're already thinking, there's a real disconnect, and you really disrupt the rhythm of the organization. And so there is, I always coach people that there is that combination of understanding what you think you need to do or want to do, but also understanding what's already happening. Because though, it's the relationship at the end of the day that's going to matter. And whether they're going to want to follow you or not is not going to be based on your brilliant new idea necessarily. It's going to be you understanding the organization, so they can also see why what you're advocating is the way to go. Mm-hmm. And so that onboarding and offboarding process, I think, is absolutely critical, and it's not done well that many places.
No, yeah, and that speaks to what we're experiencing, and I can give you the example. Our latest chief operating officer is a retired Air Force general. His leadership style, of course, is one that speaks to military personnel.
Yeah.
Very structured, the ingrained thinking, the training all the way up. And you're coming into a completely civilian organization who is speaking a completely different language, running on a completely different concept. And as I watch the styles, they just seem to be in conflict.
Yeah, that I would certainly agree with that. Having generals running VA for several past secretaries, it has the same kind of effect. I'm glad that we've gone away from that, quite frankly. That's certainly a valid observation there.
Yeah, I have heard that other agencies as well. And again, it's I love our veterans, and I'm related to quite a few of them, a number in my family. But when people do come in with that, they have a way of thinking, and they have a way of thinking things ought to run, and it's just different worldviews in some ways. Now, I've even heard it again from civilians in agencies like FEMA of, why are we now calling it 1400 instead of 2 o'clock? It's a silly little thing, right? It seems like a silly little thing.
Yeah.
But it is, they call it the militarization of the civilian workforce.
Absolutely.
And that's
just a great resource, a book for transitions and stuff. If you don't already know about it, Michael Watkins, The First 90 Days, excellent.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's got Michael does great work, and the companion First 90 Days in Government is also quite good.
Yeah, that one is more at the executive level in government, not really for the folks who I teach.
Okay, I got a question. Jim hasn't said this, but Jim, what I'm wondering is, so you transitioned you were a jet pilot for Air Force. You transitioned out of that. You got a PhD, you did research, and then you moved to government. Did you encounter this sort of from the other side as you moved into government?
Yeah, I really did. Quite frankly, you know, when I first came into civil service, I I probably wasn't really, I was a little too focused on that military style of leadership. Not that there is a style, but the fact that, you know, I think military leaders are always looked on as a hero leader, you know, and we've definitely moved away from the hero leader model. And so that leader has to be all knowing, all seeing, and do everything that all their folks do. Like, you know, I said, when that's why generals, when they're pilots, generals fly, you know, and so they do the things that they ask their folks to do. And, you know, and it wasn't for a couple of years later that I realized that, yeah, there's a different level of leadership that needs to be displayed every time you move up a level. And there's different responsibilities and different things that you have to do. And you have to make, you know, the Marshall Goldsmith, what got you here won't get you there transition. And that was probably a bigger transition to me, what got you here won't get you there, than maybe the military aspect of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that just sticks out in my mind, which doesn't resonate here, is the tagline of our current leader is "Stay in the fight." So, you know, it's like, okay.
So our tagline when I was there was, "We help put America through school."
Yeah, well, our leader tagline
That
is
one gave me goosebumps. This one, not so much.
just, you know, there's a disconnect.
Okay, Eric, I don't know if we're going off on a tangent.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, this is good.
No.
This is good discussion. This is exactly what I say. It's good to get feedback and get reactions to some of this stuff, and to hear what the kind of challenges you're facing. The other thing that I brought to show you was a new tool. It's in the book, but we really wrestled with it for quite a while, and that was how to help people have a robust and disciplined knowledge acquisition process in the middle of a crazy situation. And this one will bend your brain a bit. You may want to go pour a glass of scotch or something, but this is called, we call it driving to the known. And this goes from observations of leaders in crisis. If you look in the upper right, your known knowns, and if we have any folks who remember Donald Rumsfeld, you'll see where we got the inspiration for some of this. The known knowns are the things you know. So, you know, 249, April 15th, 2013, 2 explosions near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. We know there were 2 explosions. So where do you go from there? You know, you understand that you know it. It's very tangible. You can use it right away. And you move then to one box to the left, the known unknowns. So as soon as you get 2 explosions at a major public event, you know the questions you're going to start asking and of whom you're going to ask them. Was anybody killed? How many people were injured? You know, who's on scene? And you begin to assemble information. And about 95%, again, that's a made up number, but most situations you encounter, you solve in those 2 boxes. You know something, you know you don't know something, so you start asking questions and you fill in the blanks enough to get things done and resolve it. And so the gap between what is known and what can't be known is fairly narrow. What we've seen, though, is in large complex events, if people stop there, they get in trouble. If they don't get access to the knowledge that other people may know, that they could know, that they don't know. That's when you jump down to that unknown known box in the lower right. So, for example, I've done a lot of work with one large company in the energy sector, work with their teams all around the world. And if somebody is facing a kidnap, which to happen, they have employees kidnapped on a semi-regular basis. If you treat it like it's it's the first time and you're trying to figure it all by yourself, you can get in trouble very fast and someone can die. So they've created an internal crisis register so you know who has seen these situations before. So if you have to call up and get some knowledge quickly, you know who to go to. So they've taken that hidden knowledge and they've made it accessible to you. So they say, okay, you know what? You call Denise. She went through a kidnap 2 years ago. We know we get the protocols, but call her to see what's missing there, what you might want to know. And to make that jump down to that unknown known is a place we've seen people really fail. They fail to make that leap. When we started out our program, one of the first incidents my colleague Lenny Marcus deployed to was Katrina. And he was shadowing Mike Brown, who invited him down to see great leadership in action. And as things were falling apart, and you can find this incident on YouTube, when people started going to the convention center, because people needed a place to go. They had no home, they had no food, they had no water, so they started going to the convention center. And Mike Brown was asked about, so what are you doing about the convention center? And he said, there's nobody at the convention center. We told them all to go to the Superdome. And it was a very public argument. He gets into a back and forth with Ted Koppel, which is still on YouTube someplace. And it's like, yeah, you know how you can know that there's people at the convention center? Turn around and look at the TV because CNN's got it out there live. They very much got caught in a narrow frame of the incident and what was happening, what was possible, and didn't think to go beyond to say, who might know more than I know about this? When do you bring in outside experts? And so the idea behind just showing people this 2x2 matrix is to prompt them and say, okay, who might know that? Hey, I'm facing this. Maybe I ought to call Kitty because she knows something about this. She's been around for a while. Let's see what she knows. Because again, what we have seen is if you make honest mistakes, people will forgive you. But when there's stuff you should have known that you didn't bother to go find out, that's what they're going to hang you for. That's what Congress will get you for, the media will get you for, different regulatory bodies. And then finally on the lower left over there are the unknown unknowns, and that's the stuff you really can't know. So you don't know when a hurricane is going to pop up in the Caribbean. You may know it's a forecasted busy season, but you don't know what exactly is going to happen when. And that was most useful when you're doing scenario planning and thinking, okay, what haven't we thought of here? What if we get 3 storms in a row? What if we get an oil spill at the same time as a hurricane? Those kinds of things. And so we put this together sort of to prompt people in their thinking, because what we have seen is it's great to know what you know, but if you can know what you don't know, that helps you frame out where things may go next and get you ahead of the problem and get you very proactive in figuring out what you need to know next, who you need to talk to, who you need to bring into the team. And so, as I say, we've wrestled with it a lot. This has been the most concise we've been able to get it down to in representing it, is this. And again, we're teaching it this way for the first time in December to an incoming cohort. But Denise, have you seen this kind of problem of people get stuck not?
No, but it reminds me so much of Johari's window, in that you have down in the axis against the 90 degrees, the unknown and the unknown, and that in the Johari's window is the part that you don't know about yourself.
Yeah.
And as you move further away from that point, you get to the other side where everything is known, and then you have these spots where there is some unknown and some known. It is that same concept, except being applied to, in your case, crisis management. But I'd never thought of applying it more broadly. And it seems to me like this would be translatable into other kinds of things.
Yeah, I think there are huge amounts of knowledge inside every organization that it doesn't know it has, because you forget the stuff people came into the organization with sometimes, or you're in this job now, so we assume you know this, but we forget you had that job 3 years ago, another job 3 years ago, and you knew how to do that too. You know, I've seen it look. I've seen versions of this done where companies have captured who speaks different foreign